Good morning, I'm Steve Macaluso, and I want to tell you about my world. First and foremost, I'm from London, Ontario, Canada, or when I travel, otherwise known as the Other London. I work at Western University at Parkwood Institute, and I'm a physiatrist on the inpatient stroke and neuro rehab unit at Parkwood, and I do outpatient EMG and sports medicine. I'm also the program director, and I have a special interest in sports medicine as well as medical education, and I provide a special interest in musculoskeletal education. And at the core of everything, I'm a father and I'm a husband. And this was my world. I was healthy, happy, and busy, but this was my world. That is, until I was presented with a fairly familiar case. This was a case of a patient presenting with retrosternal chest pain, radiating down their one arm, with numbness on the one side of their body. This was a case I had heard many times before, but this wasn't happening just to any patient. This was happening to me. On December the 7th, 2017, I had a 100% occluded LAD artery. I had a widowmaker and survived. I also had a small right hemispheric stroke. That being said, that's not exactly why I want to talk to you today. You see, I know my medical history isn't necessarily novel. In fact, many of you watching are probably going through your own medical trials and tribulations that perhaps have even worse prognosis than my own. What I did want to share with you today was some of my experiences as a physiatrist and a medical educator that I think you might find interesting. First, I want you to close your eyes and think about what it would be like if you were a patient on your own rehab unit. What would it feel like to go through rehab side by side with one of your patients? Would it be weird to you? Would it be weird to them? How would it alter your patient-doctor relationship? Well, I got to find out. After my heart attack, I was in cardiac rehab, a similar setting to this. Lots of exercise equipment, lots of older faces. But from across the room, I saw a younger gentleman. Let's call him Bob. Bob was a patient of mine. He had a heart attack and a stroke as well. And when I saw Bob, I was fearful. Is this going to be weird? Is this going to change our relationship? Bob came over to talk to me. He looked up at me and said, "Doc, why are you here?" Well, by that point, I was getting pretty used to being the patient and sharing my story. I was pretty far removed from being in the emergency room weeks before, in between cardiac investigations, still answering my pager and reviewing patients with my physiatry colleagues who had no idea where I was or what I was going through. So after I finished my story, Bob looked down, he looked back at me, he shrugged his shoulders and just said, "Shit happens." And from there, he broke the ice. And we had a great relationship. Together, we shared empathy for one another, camaraderie, and a shared experience. And if there was a weird thing, it was actually that when he came back to my stroke rehab clinic months later, it wasn't weird. You see, when we were in cardiac rehab together, we got what we needed from each other, which was friendship and support. And when he was back in my outpatient clinic, I provided him with what he needed in that setting, which was my expertise as a physiatrist. Next, for those medical educators out there, have you ever been observing a resident or medical student going through a history or physical exam and wonder how your presence in the interaction has changed their behavior? What would it be like if you could be a fly on the wall observing your residents? And would that change the interaction? Well, I got to find out. At one point during my adventures, I was in a recovery space such as this, a row of beds separated by curtains. And on the other side of one of the curtains, I heard a familiar voice. It was one of the residents who had recently rotated on one of my services. And as I listened, I heard something that was a little different than what I had heard previously when I was on the wards or during OSCEs. I heard a more natural interaction than I typically did. I heard compassion, caring, and kindness. And I heard a genuine interaction between a person, the resident, and another person, the patient, who was concerned, and that the two were going through a conversation that showed compassion and caring. The bottom line is this, for the medical educators out there, good news. Your residents do act well when you're not there as well. And for the residents and medical students, I want to say this. I can always teach you knowledge, but I can't turn you into a caring person. Don't forget to care. Next, I want you to think back to a time when you had to provide some bad news to a patient. Perhaps it was an unusual diagnosis. Maybe you weren't sure what the outcome might be, but you sat down with the patient, you looked them in the eye, and you tried to comfort them, even though you worried for what their outcome might be. Now, have you ever thought what the patient can perceive in your eyes during that conversation? Well, now I know. When I looked into my colleagues' eyes as they explained my various diagnoses, I saw fear and I saw worry. But that wasn't actually a bad thing. It showed me that they cared. And actually, when I knew that they cared, I felt better about the management plan that they were proposing. You know, I'm really preaching to the choir here as a group of physiatrists, but I want to say, remember, when you're breaking bad news, don't be afraid to be human. Showing someone that you care can be very comforting. Have a plan, yes. Keep your composure, of course. But showing some humanity in those moments goes a long way to make that person feel comfortable. At least it did for me. Finally, I want to tell you about my mission to be 10% better. You see, when this all happened to me, I was a healthy, happy physiatrist in my mid-30s. And although I was exercising and eating pretty well, we can all be about 10% better in what we do. So my 10% better mission was this. I decided I was going to work 10% less. I was going to improve my diet by 10% and exercise 10% more. And probably the hardest thing was this, reducing stress by 10% by saying no to your colleagues 10% more. But the other thing I thought about was doing 10% more of the things that made me want to be a doctor in the first place, like traveling with Team Canada's athletes. At the end of the day, I hope this is a formula that adds up to 10% more time for me and my family and 10% more years for my life. Because at the end of the day, sometimes in the words of Bob, shit happens. But occasionally, a 100% occluded LED artery can add up to a 10% better life. Thank you.